Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin. Welcome to Real Agriculture. Today, we're going to look at the economic impact of farming in Ontario and what governments, from the municipal to the federal level, could do to help farmers be more prosperous and make an even bigger contribution to the province. To do that, we are going to dig into a new report from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture that does the math on farming's economic contribution and makes policy recommendations to address the challenges farmers face. For that conversation, I'm joined by OFA Senior Policy Analyst, Ben LeFort. Hi, Ben. Hey, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Bernard. I really appreciate it. Happy to be here.
Great to have you. Hey, now this report is entitled The Economic Impacts of Farming in Ontario. Tell us what OFA is trying to achieve with this work.
Sure. So we have periodically in the past had consultants do a provincial economic impact to quantify how much business revenue, how much GDP, how many jobs supported, the wages and tax revenues for government that comes from the agri-food sector. So we had there's kind of three sections to our report, kind of reflect our three goals, which is to update and quantify those numbers for the impact of primary agriculture, for the food processing sector, and then as well lay out some policy recommendations for government to help further increase those economic contributions. It had been, I believe, since 2012 was the last time we had done a report like this, and we had consulted a external consultant at the time. My background is in economics as an economist, so was happy to do that, to be able to do that in-house this time.
Hey, I want to talk policy and what farmers told you, but first let's dig into some of the numbers. And we have a total Ontario farm revenue at $34 billion. That's impressive. How do we arrive at that number?
Sure. So I think an important thing to realize with all of these numbers, and our model that we used was Statistic Canada's input-output model. And essentially that has three different effects in it, which is the so-called direct effects, which is that initial revenue from farm businesses in Ontario. And that's actually at $18 billion. There's then the other layer of business revenue that is generated from that 18 billion. And one thing I always try to stress when talking about this, the report and this kind of model, is it's not necessarily really the revenues of farmers that drives a lot of this economic impact. It's how much they're spending. What do they do with that revenue? And the revenue becomes all the expenses for a farm business becomes the revenue for another business. So there's that second layer with the indirect effects, which really measures how many businesses in Ontario generate their revenue from selling their products to farmers. So your seed suppliers, your John Deeres, anyone who sells their product directly to Ontario farmers, there is additional level of business revenue that is supported by the farm, because without farms, they would have nobody to sell to. And then there's a third layer, which is kind of that induced effect, which shows, there's certain amount of employees that are employed by farms, and they get paid. And on payday, how many businesses do they spend their paychecks at locally? And how much business revenue in Ontario is then driven by those wages? So that's how we get to the 34 billion. There's the 18 billion in that initial farm revenue. That creates an additional 12 billion in that indirect revenue from all those input supply businesses, and is really critical part of the supply chain in Ontario. And then there's an additional 4 billion of employee wages that are being spent at local businesses throughout the province. And that brings us from 18 billion all the way up to nearly $34.5 billion of business revenue that's sustained by farms.
Right. So let's take a quick snapshot at some of the other numbers. What about GDP? What's the impact there?
Yeah. So again, I'll more quickly move through those three layers. So there's the initial direct GDP from initial spending of farms, which is $7 billion in provincial GDP. But by the time, again, you include all those indirect and induced impacts, that gets up to over $15.3 billion of Ontario's GDP, which is supported by primary agriculture.
Now you've got a big number for employment and wages as well. I also want to talk about taxation. And this is always a big point of contention for farmers, especially when it comes to farm property taxes at the municipal level, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That has been so. I cover tax policy for OFA. That property tax has been the number one issue I've dealt with for the last 13 years. I'll quickly go over those job numbers and the labor income that's supported from those jobs. So the total jobs supported, if we kind of widen out to those indirect effects as well. Ontario agriculture supports 300,000 jobs throughout the province. And that translates into $7.8 billion in income paid to workers that is sustained by the primary ag sector in Ontario. So all of this revenue, all the GDP, all these jobs, all the spending from farms, this all then translates as well, not only to economic benefits for everybody in Ontario, but also direct revenue for all three levels of government. So again, fast forward, like kind of pushing back out to the big number of including the indirect effects, we see nearly $1.3 billion in government revenue that's split between the three levels of government. And as you alluded to, property taxes is the big one. So of that 1.3 billion, 561 million goes to municipalities through property taxes. An additional 458 million goes to the province through, HST or income tax, et cetera. And 250 million goes to the federal government. Right. So it's kind of a reverse order from the local government to the federal government, but the local municipalities, and again, it's not surprising, agriculture is a land-based business, that property tax would be such a significant component of the contribution to government revenue.
Now, at OFA, you also asked your farmer members for their thoughts on policy recommendations to build the Ontario farm economy and help it reach its full potential. What did they tell you? I'm assuming that reducing the tax burden was probably at the top of the list.
Yes. So for the second year in a row, we just wrapped up our second annual Farm Business Confidence Survey, where we asked farmers a whole bunch of questions about what they were investing in their business over the past year, their confidence in the sector and in their own business heading into 2025, and as well as what are the top issues that they're worried about for their business, and what are the top policy priorities that they want OFA working on. And in regards to the top policy priorities, in last year's survey, we had a clear top three, which were to reduce the tax burden, which is by far the number one. Supporting farmers with energy costs was the second item identified, and encouraging Ontarians to buy local food at number three. And I would say on our second survey here, we also asked a follow-up question, knowing that taxes was likely to rate very highly. Which form of taxation was most impactful for their business? And of that, we saw that property taxes was far and away number one, and carbon tax was number two, but it was a distant number two.
Yeah. That's the thing, Ben. I mean, farm property taxes, and you've got a slide here that's really interesting. Municipalities are hiking taxes and getting more of their revenue from farm property taxes. We haven't seen a new land value assessment, I guess, since 2016. It's going to come, but this has got to be a big concern for farmers.
Yes, absolutely. So, yeah, we have been looking at this, and this was really one of the first big issues I started working on with at OFA when I started in 2013. And it really stems from over the last two MPAC assessment cycles. What really is going to determine the tax burden and kind of how I define that is, the percentage of the tax levy that farmers are paying. Right? So the municipality needs to collect what they need to collect to run the municipality. The issue we've seen is farmland values and therefore MPAC assessments have been going through the roof for farmland since 2012. And in a lot of rural areas from 2012 to 2016, and as you mentioned, we're still working with 2016 MPAC values. During that time, residential values in many rural areas were flat. And we were actually losing commercial and industrial assessment at that time. So, property tax is in a sense a zero-sum game. Like I said, the municipality needs to collect where they got to collect. And it's the assessment values, or that relative assessment change between farmland, residential, and commercial, that's going to determine who they get that from. And with farmland values going through the roof, residential values staying flat, and actually losing commercial values, what we've seen is each year from 2012 to 2022, was the data we were measuring here in this slide, was that each year farms were paying a little bit more of the total tax pie, if you will, than they were the year before. So as an example, in Perth County in 2012, just over 17% of the total tax levy came from farm taxes. And by 2022, that had jumped to nearly 28.5% of the county tax levy coming from that same group of farmers. And in fact, from 2012 to 2022, likely had fewer acres of farmland, not more. So on a per acre basis, a very significant increase in the tax burden during that time.
Yeah, certainly a big issue for sure. Hey, one final point before I let you go, and that's something I want to touch on, and that is how Ontario and Canada can compete with other nations. Of course, with the Trump tariff threats, there's a lot of focus now on what we can do in Canada to make our industries more competitive. In your report, you compared how U.S. farmers are taxed versus Ontario and Canadian farmers. What did you see here? There's certainly some changes that the federal government could make to make farmers more competitive here.
Yeah, so competitiveness is certainly top of mind for us, and right now we're doing a lot of bit of work on some background comparing tax policy in the U.S. to Canada to try to identify some areas where Canadian farmers and our members of Ontario farmers are at a bit of a competitive disadvantage with our neighbors to the south for U.S. farmers. And in the report, one of the areas we've initially looked at are the rules around capital cost deduction, which can be really kind of complicated and a bit clunky. But essentially what this is all about is if you buy, you're a farmer or any business, but if our case, we're worried about farmers, if you buy a large piece of equipment like a combine or something very significant in value, under our current capital cost deduction rules, you can only deduct a certain percentage of that cost in the first year that you've purchased it. And that's really what the question is how much of that X $100,000 piece of equipment can you deduct in the first year? And in the U.S., their rules make it much easier to deduct, in some cases, up to 100% of the costs of capital equipment. Up to a certain threshold, but in some cases they can actually deduct 100%, where we are a single-digit percent in that first year in many cases. So what we've been pushing for, and we have a resolution going forward to the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and their AGM at the end of the month, end of February, is to adopt a similar policy that we see in the U.S., which would allow farmers up to a threshold to deduct 100% of that capital cost, which would then free up more cash for them to reinvest more aggressively in their business. And really, this is all about freeing up that cash and incentivizing farmers to make big capital purchases, which is really going to drive efficiency and will drive those top line economic numbers even further.
Yeah. Well, hey, I guess, and there's lots more to this story, Ben. A great conversation. Hey, where can our viewers get more information on the report, or get their hands on the report to dig in there?
Sure. So we did do a member webinar on OFA's YouTube channel that will live there. If you'd like a full copy of the report, members feel free to reach out to me, and I can send them a report directly at any time.
Awesome. Well, Ben, hey, great conversation. Really thank you for joining us on Real Agriculture.
Thank you so much.